t'aime, Bruxelles, je t'aime. Tu m'avais manqué, Bruxelles, je t'aime, Bruxelles, je t'aime. T'es ma préférée, Bruxelles, je t'aime, Bruxelles, je t'aime.
Hello there and welcome to Brussels, My Love, our weekly talk show that dives into the highs and lows of EU politics. I'm Maeve McMahon. Thanks for tuning in. Coming up this week, democracy under fire. In more and more countries, strongmen are gaining the upper hand, with political rights and personal freedoms increasingly up for grabs. From Hungary banning gay pride to Turkey cracking down on protesters. We're taking a closer look and asking if the United States is retreating from its role as the guardian of democracy. And Israeli strikes on targets in the Gaza Strip and Lebanon, as well as rocket attacks on Israel. The cycle of violence and counter-violence in the Middle East is back. The ceasefire that has only been in place for a short time seems already history. Meanwhile, the fate of remaining Israeli hostages remains uncertain, and with it, the chances of a lasting peace overall. Does diplomacy still have a chance? And what is the role of Brussels? The questions we're posing with our panel this weekend. Shada Islam, Director at New Horizons Project. Welcome. Jen Godfrey, the Director of the European Partnership for Democracy. And Jérôme Bellion-Jourdan, a negotiation expert and former European diplomat who's based in Geneva. Thanks so much for coming into us and for joining. But before we hear from you, as always, let's just take a look at what this town was talking about this week.
Recep Tayyip Erdogan once put it like this: democracy is like a tram. You ride it until you arrive at your destination. Then you step off. Looks like some other fellow populist travelers, from Viktor Orban to Donald Trump, have reached their final stop as well. Their campaigns against democratic rules are in full swing. Silencing or intimidating political opponents, Erdogan's rival Ekrem İmamoğlu, the mayor of Istanbul, was arrested on corruption charges. Suppressing minorities, Hungary's ruling Fidesz party fast-tracked a bill banning pride marches held by the LGBTQ community. Attacking free speech, the Trump administration took action against media outlets and blackmailed universities to comply with Trump's world views. According to the organization Freedom House, political rights and civil liberties around the world deteriorated to their lowest point in more than a decade. Is democracy becoming a phase-out model?
So a lot to pick apart there. I mean, a lot to digest, really. Shada, perhaps we'll start with you. What's going on in Turkey? I mean, it's not a huge surprise, I imagine, these protests.
No, not a huge surprise. It's been going on for some time, but now it's really out there and open, and Erdogan has no limits as to what he wants to do and can do, given the current environment. So the arrest of the mayor of Istanbul, arrest of journalists, just going for the human rights defenders. And he feels he can do it because you've got Donald Trump in Washington, as you said, and you've got our own Viktor Orban. We've got these populist and far-right leaders also sort of setting the agenda. So who's to stop him? And we could, as Europeans, but we've been quite muted in our criticism. And that's because Turkey matters a lot when we're dealing with Russia, an aggressive Russia. Turkey has the arms, the soldiers, and he can bring the support as well. So we're in a bit of a bind there, I think, Maeve.
And indeed, as you say, it's not just the mayor of Istanbul who's behind bars. Over 1,000 have been behind bars. We even saw on Thursday a BBC journalist was detained for many hours and in fact deported from the country. And when a BBC journalist is given this sort of treatment, it makes global news. Jérôme, what is your assessment of the situation?
Well, my assessment, I would agree with Shada, but I think we need to look at it in a broader context. The EU, seen from Brussels, has always claimed that it was supporting democracy worldwide. In practice, what is it that we've done? We've been supportive of authoritarian regimes, in all regions, because we wanted to have access to raw materials, to oil, gas, because we wanted to sell weapons, because we wanted to, Erdogan or others to stop migration flows. So I think we've made those decisions. That when it comes to supporting democracy, we're not necessarily a powerful actor, or at least we're not doing what we claim we are doing. So in the case of Turkey, I think it's not it shouldn't be singled out to a broader issue, which is that we're not necessarily very supportive in action of democratization. If we take, the Arab Spring, for instance, I mean, it was a huge opportunity. Where was the EU to support that trend towards democracy in the Middle East? No way.
Maybe I would say something that I think that now the response is more muted than it would have been. I think we would probably all agree than 5 years ago, or maybe even a few months ago, considering what's happened in the United States and considering the vulnerability of European countries on the security front. I agree with you that very often there are sort of double standards in this, but the EU still is, according to the treaties and many of the countries, it's an obligation to try to support these values, which are founding values of the European Union. So in general, should be doing more, but I agree with you, there are other interests which are taking precedence over, such as raw materials, energy, security issues that trump sometimes these democratic
And Brussels knows very well how much it needs Turkey. I mean, especially as well when it comes to addressing irregular migration. But I'd like to bring in a Turkish voice now, and we can hear from Bahar Kim Yongur. He's a Belgian-Turkish writer based here in Brussels, and this is how he feels about President Erdogan.
He is facing Ekrem İmamoğlu, who is the main Turkish candidate for the next elections. Basically, he says that if the US can bomb Yemen or Israel can just destroy Gaza, why I could not behave in the same way towards my opposition? And the problem is also the behavior of the European partners. He says to Europe, okay, let me be the bulwark towards Russia, but in the same time I want to be the European Putin. I want to be the Turkish Putin, working for the interests of Western Europe.
That was the assessment there of Bahar Kim Yongur, a Belgian-Turkish journalist. The big issue, he's saying, is that Erdogan is afraid of Imamoglu, the candidate for the presidential elections. His elections taking place in 3 years.
Yeah, I mean, I think the calculations of Erdogan are multiple. I mean, he's obviously facing a situation internally, but he knows that he's got a leverage and a role in his relationship with the EU. He knows that at the regional level in the Middle East, I mean, Turkey has become a key player on the global stage as well. So I think that he knows all of this, and in his calculation, he's maybe betting that he can do away with cracking on the opposition, knowing that he will get the support he needs externally.
And he said this week, the EU cannot live without Turkey. Those were the words of President Erdogan. But Shada, from your perspective, someone who's been following Turkey and the EU for many years, do you think this could be the beginning of the end for President Erdogan?
It's very difficult to say that. I wouldn't go so far as to say it could be the end, but he does have opposition. And I think Ekrem is a very, very strong voice and has a great deal of support in Turkey. He's a Democrat as well, and he's a liberal and he's a progressive. So all of the things that run counter to what Erdogan stands for. But we live in a world where, as you've said, both of you, authoritarianism is on the rise. And the models they have, whether it's Donald Trump, whether it's Viktor Orban, and ourselves as Europeans looking the other way, because we need Turkey, as you said, for migration, also to fight off Russia, So we're actually, in a way, incentivizing and encouraging, emboldening the authoritarians in our neighborhood and beyond, I would say, as well. And that's a big change from 5 years ago.
And this is something you've been looking into now at your organisation.
Yes, we have. I mean, look, there's often with democracy, it's not linear process. So sometimes, there are different countries, they go in different directions. But at least what lots of academics have shown over the last decade is that there is a regression. There's a significant regression. Media freedom, right to freedom of association, freedom of assembly, integrity of elections. And here in Turkey, we can see that they still hold elections. The real danger is, will they be fair ones? They're likely to probably be quite free, but will they actually be fair? And we can see there are already steps being taken, even though the elections are rather far away, to undermine the fairness and the ability of others to challenge Erdogan. And from that point of view, it takes from a very clear playbook. There is a clear playbook of undermining the judiciary, etc. What we see actually that's quite interesting is that the response has been less from European governments and more from the markets. The Turkish central bank has been, they've been forced to try and prop up the currency in different ways. And so from that point of view, we can see that there is pushback here from authoritarians, people not so sure about the future. And I'm sure that there will be Turkish citizens that will continue to protest because they view this as existential for their rights and freedoms in the future.
Well, I've seen a lot of students being interviewed, and they certainly say they will. But just on press freedom, what you mentioned there, according to reporters, the borders deteriorated last year in Turkey, more detentions and more judicial harassment. But just looking at you, because you're a negotiator, there is meant to be talks between Brussels and Ankara in April on the economy and on migration. Should the EU continue with these talks, or should they put them on hold because of the situation now, or how should they manage this one?
Well, as a diplomat, I'm always in favor of dialogue and talks. I think the question is not necessarily having talks or not, is having the vision. And I think what we lack from Brussels currently is a vision of what is it that we want for our relationship with Turkey as a government, but also the people. But the same applies to relationship to all countries in the region in the Middle East. I think we lack that vision, and until we get there, then we can have ways and means to dialogue, to use leverage, but that vision is not very clear now.
And what leverage do we have?
Well, the thing is, if your own member states, we've talked about Hungary, Poland, Slovakia, Bulgaria, Romania, when you have backsliding on that scale in so many countries, judicial processes being subverted, media being arrested, if not arrested, putting censorship on. So we've got our own very serious problems, and we're not reacting to them as strongly as we should, because once you're a member state, the leverage is less, but also because these authoritarians or these people have been elected. They were brought in, institutionally. They were brought in. And so it's not through coups anymore that things are done. Subversion of democracy is not necessarily having a military coup or, someone coming in and destroying the structures. They're actually using the structures very skillfully. And we're seeing this across the world, and makes it more difficult, doesn't it, to make it clear that, this is not democracy. We're not dealing with dictators. They turn back and say, yeah, we were elected. I think that's the dilemma that many of us face now.
And it's not just in Brussels where these concerning conversations are taking place about what's going on in Turkey. I saw also the Council of Europe, as they gathered as well in Strasbourg, had a major point on this. But you mentioned EU member states and their behaviour. And in fact, a lot of people in this town were talking about the Hungarian government this week, who are cracking down on basic rights. We saw last week the Prime Minister, Viktor Orban, saying he would ban this year's annual gay pride parade and let police use biometric facial recognition to identify people in order to enforce the ban. The move that he says aspires to protect children from, quote, woke ideology has sparked outrage here among many MEPs, saying that he should be sanctioned for this. Ken, what is your take on that?
Well, I think it's part of his general playbook of trying to find scapegoats within society. And from that point of view, we've seen him undermine, as Shada said, very slowly different parts of the democratic system. Here, sort of the right to protest or right to for people to freedom of assembly in the streets should be allowed. It should be there. It's in the Charter of Fundamental Rights. Here, in my opinion, these type of moves are actually designed to take the conversation away from issues linked to democracy and the democratic behaviour towards things related to culture and this sort of so-called culture wars that many of these leaders, it's part of the playbook that they use in order to divert attention from other things that they're doing to the democratic system. And that's the key thing. We need to be looking at what's happening to the democratic system, because if you look at Viktor Orban and you think about, we take the example of Turkey, or we take the example of other places around the world, there's a significant impact on EU foreign policy as well, because they're unable to agree on things because there is a government within the European Union that disagrees with others because of the undermining of democratic institutions.
Well, like last week, the summit conclusions were signed by 26 countries. But let's be honest here. Viktor Orban, Jerome, is a very popular man in Hungary. He really won those elections, and he won them rather well. But is this something that might really upset his supporters?
I mean, I would say, populism in various countries is taken as the threat for democracy. But I think we need to take it maybe a step backward and look at populism as an illustration of the frustration of citizens. I think what we don't do well is to listen carefully to each citizen. If we are Democrat, we shouldn't say, those people have elected someone, so they have to pay the price for. No, we need to understand where they come from. Why is it that they have issues? And there are issues with our democracy as it is now. I think there are questions of where powers are. The kind of a confusion between economic power and political power, the role of lobbies, the fact that increasingly people also see that the rule of law is not necessarily applied in the same way to all. The fact that so I think all these questions have to be addressed. Otherwise, I fear that what we may see is a trend towards more of this in the coming years.
Well, here, of course, what the Commission will look into using potentially is the legal tools. Has the Hungarian government broken the law here? We have the AI Act. That's something that the MEP in charge of the AI Act, Brandy Bonifay, told our reporter Chandra Zeros this week that potentially we could see an EU member state here breaching our very own data protection rules and AI Act, using these tools that are supposed to be used to catch criminals and terrorists just on revellers going out to support gay pride.
But do we actually have the political courage to go ahead and do it? This is what I wonder about. And, to your point about how skillfully the populists, the far-right populists, deflect from the real issues that face us, which is economic inequality, economic precarity, and take us onto the terrain of culture wars. They do it very skillfully. And our centrist politicians fall into the trap and magnify and amplify the discriminatory, xenophobic message of the populists. So there's no way the centrists can win, because the simplistic message that the far right is giving on issues to do with racism, migration, etc., minorities generally, is a very simple message. You blame them for all your problems. And we can't fight on that terrain. We have to be more aggressive and assertive on that terrain, and we're not. We're accepting their model. So our far right, in a very, very subtle way, is sabotaging, has hijacked our European agenda on issues like migration, union of equality, but also climate, also digital, as you've just pointed out. So all of the values that we sort of set up as our beacons for the future are being subverted very skillfully by far right here. They don't have to be in power necessarily, Maeve. They can do it from the outside just through pressure. It's very, very, very challenging.
Yeah, and we can see the centre-right particularly shifting in many instances towards greater support for certain policies coming from the far right. One thing I would say with regards to Hungary, Viktor Orban is popular, but we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that in the last elections, independent observers said that the elections were not fair, right? So that there is a certain degree with which the ruling regime, the Fidesz party, has manipulated the elections in order to favour media coverage, things like this. And so...
But I was there reporting for Euronews, and I met a lot of people who do support him and did vote for him.
There will be people who support and we can see that the rise now of his main opposition figure, well, there are lots of people in the street at the moment, turning out to support him but we don't know what will happen in the next elections. What I think we do know is that there's this move centralising power. So there's centralising power. Let's try and reduce the amount of independent voices in the media. Let's try and reduce in Parliament. Let's try and reduce in the judicial sector. So undermining this separation of powers, undermining alternative voices to try and centralise power. And this leads to, I think, the point that Jerome was making, this interpretation for people of democracy failing to deliver. What I would argue, and what has been shown, I think there was the Economist Intelligence Unit had a big report about this, it's failure to deliver fairness. People do not think that there's justice, that there's fair outcomes being delivered by their democracies. And as a result, you see that, oh gosh, we've got a bit of a problem, we're not delivering here. Well, let's move to something else. Let's focus on something else, like a Pride March, in which we can divert attention to something like this.
And Jerome, just from your perspective, how should Brussels deal with this issue?
Well, I think from Brussels, in the relationship with member states, we should also see the way we behave on the global stage. If we undermine international law when it comes to Israel-Palestine, for instance, what sort of signal are we sending internally about one of the foundations of the EU, which is rule of law?
And just on rule of law, it has been deteriorating. According to a report, a 1,000-page report by the Civil Liberties Union for Europe, I'm sure Ken, you've had a good read of that report. It refers to what you just referred to, the public service media facing pressure, the restrictive laws being used to undermine the work of civil society. It feels like we're really regressing here as opposed to progressing.
Yeah, and I've been shocked, Maeve, to see the crackdown on pro-Palestinian demonstrations in many, many parts of Europe. I mean, this assembly of, free assembly is one of our values, and there's also censorship. There's been actions against students. I mean, not as violently as in the US, but it's been the case here as well. And those are also against our democratic
Who should
standards.
be standing up then for these values?
Government.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the European Union in some ways can take a stand with regards to rule of law. So there's the mechanism rule of law conditionality, that funds from the European Union budget should not be sent to European Union member states that undermine the rule of law. It's related to corruption, misuse of funds, etc., etc. This is linked to somehow some of those Article 2 values which find themselves in the Treaty of the European Union. And so there are some things that can be done. Also on media freedom, concentration of media. There's a European Media Freedom Act. There's also with regards to the monetization of disinformation on the platforms, so the big tech platforms, Digital Services Act, there's a Digital Markets Act. So there are several tools that came in with the last von der Leyen Commission that can be used in order to try and take a stand. But in the end, also it is citizens, it's opposition parties. There must be mobilization to say that these things, we care about these things. We want future elections to be fair. We want to have rule of law and independent judiciary and a public service media that is not overtly controlled by the party in power.
So Ken, they're listing all the tools on the table, but of course they do need to be implemented. On that point, we can bring this conversation to an end. Thank you so much to our panel. And you stay with us here on Euronews, because shortly we'll be diving into another topic of concern, and that is the ongoing Israel-Hamas war. See you very soon here on Euronews. Welcome back to Brussels, my love, our weekly chat show with me, Maeve McMahon. Well, with the news cycle dominated by attempts to end the war in Ukraine and Trump's tariff threats, it feels like the Middle East has been slightly forgotten, even though just last week a fragile ceasefire that came into force on January 19th was broken when Israel struck Gaza, killing hundreds, including UN staffers. In return, Hamas fired rockets at Israel. And this Wednesday, we saw hundreds of Palestinians take to the streets to protest against Hamas, calling for an end to the war. Jérôme, what's your assessment of this situation? Why did Israel break the ceasefire?
Well, I think there's definitely a domestic political agenda for Prime Minister Netanyahu and many other considerations. But I think it has also to do with the fact that the EU, as we speak from Brussels, has not done for many years what it could have done. When I hear High Rep Callas going to Jerusalem a few days ago and saying two-state solution, when I was posted in Jerusalem, and by the way, I went to Gaza after military operation, I saw the destruction. I cannot imagine what the destruction can be today. But the two-state solution, has the EU done anything to deliver on the two-state solution? My view is that the EU has undermined the two-state solution by fueling in the Palestinian divide. If we have the division between West Bank, Gaza, Fatah, Hamas, it is largely because the EU failed to recognize the outcome of the elections in 2006, when Hamas won the elections and preferred to use its leverage to support the Palestinian Authority under the president of Mahmoud Abbas. We've also, successfully supported all governments of Israel for many years, including those headed by Prime Minister Netanyahu, knowing very well that those governments were undermining the two-state solution by the expansion of settlements, and this is ongoing.
Would you agree with that, Shada? And also I'm curious to hear your reaction to the Palestinians who were out on the streets. They're going against Hamas, very courageously perhaps.
They are indeed, but historically, I think, Maeve, history will not be kind to the European Union, and I agree with you, Jérôme, on that. I think when it comes to the Middle East, we're really becoming irrelevant. We're not even, it's the case also over Ukraine, and we can talk about it, but in the Middle East, the EU was a player. It wasn't just a payer, as often people say, but it was a major player. And in those days, we had a voice, and we were calibrated, really, really balanced in our assessment of what was happening. What we're seeing now is a really strong pro-Israeli tilt. More than a tilt. Israel has been accused of genocide by Amnesty, by Human Rights Watch, and for us, it's business as usual. As you said, Kaya Kalas was there, we're still trading, we're still exporting arms, whereas Israel is in clear violation of humanitarian law, the Geneva Conventions. So we're losing relevance, we're losing credibility, not just with the leaders of the region, because the leaders will do deals, as we've said, with the EU because of money and all the rest of it, but with the civil society, the change makers, the agents of change. And of course there will be some unhappiness with Hamas. Of course there will be, because people are suffering. I mean, you know,
They just want to see an end to the suffering.
well, exactly. 600 people killed since the ceasefire, you know, just over a few days. Children being killed. So, of course, there will be anger and frustration at where things are at. I think that's normal human reaction.
Ken?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, look at I think this week there was over 50,000 people have been killed in Gaza. It's a lot of people. And of course, people will be outraged. Their lives have been turned upside down. And I agree with you. I think there is a very strong Israeli domestic political agenda here that is continuing to perpetuate the conflict. And I think from a European Union point of view, I would very much agree with Shada. If you look back at, take the wider region, you know, the nuclear discussions with Iran, well, the EU had a very clear role to play. The High Representative had a very clear role to play, and you can't see anything like that today.
They were back in the days of Federica Mogherini, who
Correct,
had a
exactly.
key role there. But we can bring in now a voice from a local professor here in Brussels to hear his take on the ongoing war and, of course, the consequences.
Aujourd'hui, il n'y a personne qui respecte dans les belligérants
Today, none of the warring parties respect international law, not even the states themselves, despite being members of institutions like the United Nations. As a result, humanitarian law is being disregarded. The UN keeps calling for international law to be respected, but if it doesn't have the power to enforce it, those calls don't mean much. If negotiations take place, they will likely be between the United States and Israel. From the perspective of international law, the Palestinians' right to determine their own future will not be upheld, as they will most likely have no representatives at the negotiating table.
ne sera pas respecté parce que très probablement il n'y aura pas de représentants de ce peuple dans les négociations.
That was Professor Talhe Darinavard there. Question as well, I wonder, is what is the point of the UN if it's not achieving its goal of keeping peace?
Well, the United Nations is based on member states, right? It doesn't have any of its own sort of powers. It doesn't have a military force, etc. So it depends on whether member states or members are willing to go ahead. And in this case, we're divided. I mean, the European Union also is very, very divided on how we approach Israel-Palestine issue.
And meanwhile, you've got President Trump, whose plans for Gaza are very clear. He was very vocal, Jerome, about them when President Benjamin Netanyahu was in the room with him, saying he wants to turn it into the Riviera of the Middle East.
Yes, I mean, I think that's a plan which unfortunately might still be unfolding, even if there's a bit of a pushback. But I think on the UN, I mean, we have a UN General Assembly resolution of September, setting a deadline of September 2025 for Israel to end its occupation. So the question is, what is it that, as European Union, that we're doing on delivering on this UNG resolution, UN General Assembly resolution? And the leverage is there. I mean, the EU has a lot of leverage. We're speaking to an audience of European citizens. Do European citizens agree that taxpayers' money is used to reconstruct the Gaza Strip, knowing that it might be destroyed and down the line? Do consumers agree to continue buying settlement products coming from Israeli settlements in a situation where the EU policy is very clear? Settlements are illegal under international law. So I think connecting also to what we discussed about democracy, citizens may want also to have a bit of a say on the way we define our leverage and what we can do in this part of the world.
Okay.
We used to send Israel in the past under Javier Solana, we used to send them a bill every time they destroyed an EU-funded television station or school or whatever they used to do those days. We used to send them a bill. We also had restrictions on imports of exports from illegal settlements. We don't do that anymore.
Okay. And for more on that story, you can take a look at euronews.com, but we'll have to conclude on that point. Thank you so much to our panellists for your insights and your analysis. And thank you so much for watching. Stay with us here on Euronews. Hello there and welcome to Brussels, my love, our weekly talk show here on Euronews. I'm Maeve McMahon, and along with our panel this weekend, Shada Islam, the director at New Horizons Project, Jen Godfrey, the director of the European Partnership for Democracy, and Jérôme Bellion-Jourdan, a negotiation expert and former European diplomat. We're just taking a look back at the news of the week. And this week we saw the French President, Emmanuel Macron, making good on his promise to keep supporting Ukraine by hosting the so-called Coalition of the Willing in Paris on Thursday. The Ukrainian President Zelensky was there to physically update his counterparts on the state of play of the Saudi-led peace talks. So I guess the question to the panellists here is, was it a success? It was called, obviously, the Coalition of the Willing, but the amount of willingness seemed to be quite different among member states, Jérôme.
And the question is, a coalition of the willing to do what? If we talk about negotiation, I believe that this war could have been avoided maybe through negotiation.
Back in 2014,
back in 2022, before the war, I think the toolbox of negotiation has not been used fully, and we've left it to the US, Biden at the time, and the Russian Federation, Putin to escalate and leading to a situation of war. Now the question is, what I see from the EU side is that there seems to be an agreement that we need to continue supporting Ukraine military, but there's no vision for the end game, for how to get out of this conflict. And experts agree that the military solution is not an option. So we'll have to have a negotiation. And if we continue in this way, I'm afraid we'll leave it to the US and the Russian Federation to agree on terms, and the EU will be nowhere to be seen to influence the course of events.
And domestically, Shada, we saw Emmanuel Macron pledging $2 billion to support the Ukrainians, but a lot of French complaining that he should be using that money to fix France as opposed to help Ukraine.
Well, this is going to start happening across Europe, I have a feeling, because, governments are going ahead and I think in a sense rightly pushing, for more aid to Ukraine and giving supplies, military supplies, etc. I don't think there's any harm in doing that. The problem is, where's the money going to come from? Are you going to be cutting our European budgets on social security, social welfare, health, education? Our society is polarized at the moment and suffering really from economic precarity. It's a real thing for real people outside, and I'm not sure our ministers and our EU policymakers realize how precarious life is for many of our citizens, and I think all of that will come into play as we go further down. The problem is, at the moment, there is, once again, I think, we're working in a very, very fragile environment. We don't hold the reins to what happened. Those are in Moscow and Washington, and all we can do is watch from the sidelines and make some suggestions, just hoping someone will hear them, and I'm not sure that they're willing ears to hear that.
Watch from the sidelines. It seems to be quite a regular thing, right, for us?
Yeah, but I do think that there is some leverage on the EU side linked to sanctions, so things like SWIFT, etc. But, I think there's a good saying which describes a predicament, which is if you're not sitting at the table, you're on the menu. And this is really a bit of it's a big problem for Ukraine, most directly, but it is a big problem for European security. European countries or the European Union should be at the table for a big discussions like this, but because of the lack of military punch, they're not.
Okay. And we can listen now actually to President Zelensky and get his take on the talks.
Нам потрібен рух до реального миру, до гарантованої безпеки.
We need a movement towards real peace, towards guaranteed security. And we all need this. In Ukraine, in Europe, in America, everyone in the world who wants peace in international relations. Russia is the only entity that is dragging out this war and mocking our people and the whole world. And to pressure Russia towards peace, strong things, strong steps are needed.
Потрібні сильні речі, сильні кроки.
President Zelensky there making it clear that he wants peace, but as you said, it would be tricky to get it, especially with not having the Europeans at the table. And Shada, we saw this week the European Commission come out with a plan to help Europeans get us ready for a crisis. EU governments are meant to have this survival kit for us, make sure that we can stockpile food and medical supplies. Is this a good idea to get us ready for war here on this continent, or is it a bit exaggerated?
I'm afraid I think it's a bit exaggerated. I think we should be pushing for diplomacy and peace and getting our citizens ready for peace rather than for war. You know, I was born in a country which was perpetually at war with its neighbor, and it really sends real chills down my spine to see Europe heading in the same direction. I think we should really give diplomacy a chance, peace a chance, and prepare our citizens for that. And I don't think we're doing this, and it really worries me. It worries me. We do need security. I'm not saying we don't. We definitely need to boost our defenses and our security, but that should go hand in hand with building up a climate for peace as well.
Because there's a lot of anxiety as well out there. A lot of people, they're not even turning on the television. They don't want to watch the news. They're too scared.
But they should be watching us. No, I think there's a bit of a difference though. But if you're sitting in Finland or Estonia, Lithuania, I can understand the preparedness, because Russia has invaded its neighbour under very flimsy pretext. I mean, incredibly flimsy pretext. What's to say that it won't repeat that? I think it's different if you're in Portugal or you're in Italy or something. I think it's a different reality, right, to people who are in Finland, and they are preparing, you know, more people, reservists, dusting off bunkers and things like this. It does seem a bit exaggerated, but who are we to say when we're not sitting there ourselves?
Well, there's the threat as well of cyber attacks, hybrid warfare, and then potential armed aggression. But also, just looking to the week ahead, the Commission will be coming out with a plan to provide $2 billion to help projects to cut our dependence even on critical raw materials and minerals from outside the European Union. This sounds like a good plan.
Well, it is, I think the issue of sovereignty of Europe is to be seen in many ways. I do agree with what was said about, there's a bit of a climate of feeding this idea of fear from the Russian Federation. But if we look across the board, I mean, there are many other challenges that we face. And I think, raw materials, fine, but it's also the question of where do we get our supply from? How do we handle the relationship with the states, connecting to what we discussed about democracy? Are we willing to compromise on democracy to get raw materials? I mean, all these issues should be seen in as a whole and not in silo.
Okay, and just on the rare materials that the Trump administration is hoping to get from the Ukrainians, we're looking like they could come to a deal very, very soon. But for now, we can bring this conversation to an end. Thank you so much to our panellists this weekend. Shada Islam, Director at New Horizons Project, Ken Godfrey, the Director of the European Partnership for Democracy, and Jérôme Bellion-Jourdan, a negotiation expert and former European diplomat. And thank you so much for watching. Keep the conversation going. Reach out to us here. It's brusselsmylove@euronews.com. That is our email address. You can also follow us directly on social media, and we will get back to you. Take care and see you soon.